Hi, I'm Rodney, and I wouldn't have thought that there was anything more to say about getting to HTR from 2/4 turns away, but I've been using this system of analysis that I'm finding really intuitive and has helped me identify some cases that I wasn't previously aware of, so I thought I would share. I'm just going to talk about the most basic 2/4 turn HTR trigger that everyone knows, this one where the corners are U, F2, U. But the key is I'm going to think about the corners and the edges separately. So if I were to just solve the corners, that's U, F2, U. In this case, if I wanted to solve the edges, I would also use a F2, U, F2, U. So this is an optimal trigger. If by but suppose my edges look like this. So if I wanted to solve these edges without thinking about the corners, I would do a UL to U, and that would bring my edges into HTR. But of course, that's rotated 1 with respect to the corners. So the corners need UF to U, and the edges need UL to U. So I'm going to call this case R1. The edges and the corners are rotated 1 click with respect to each other. And then, of course, this is the R2 case where the edges are solved by a U, B2U, and the corners need a UF to U. So this is R2, R1, R0, and there's no need for an R3 because it's just a mirror of the R1. So for each case, I'm going to keep track of the number of additional moves it takes to set up the edges compared to just the corners. So those 2E cases are +0, +2, and +4. For the 4E cases, I can do the same thing. Here's here's this one is +1. That's a U R2 F2 to solve both the corners and edges. So that's optimal. This one is a U L2 F2 U to solve both the edges. So those are both I would call those R0 and R2 that are kind of a rotation of each other. And then the bad rotation case is this one where my bad edges are here. And that's a +3. Now the question, how do I rotate my edges with respect to my corners? Well, I do it actually by rotating the corners with a wide corner swap. A wide corner swap is like F2, R2, B2. What does that do? That actually moves these corners here, these corners here, these corners here, right? So it rotates the corners 1 click. So if I do an F2, R2, B2, it rotates my corners. That's how to fix this bad rotation case. It also moves everything from top to bottom, so it actually moves these like this, right? So if I include both of my bad edges in that wide corner swap, then they will also move, and I'll change this R1 into either an R2 or an R0. So an L2, F2, R2 turns that R1 case into an R0. And if I go in the other direction, like R2, F2, L2, now I've turned it into an R2. And of course, there's a wide corner swap that starts with any side move, so you'll always be able to find one with a cancellation. There's one other aspect of how the edges and corners are oriented with respect to each other. Suppose my case looks like this. So here's my corners are U, F to U, and my edges are U prime F to U. So I would say that this has odd directional parity of edges with respect to corners. These need a U, these need a U prime. So how do I change the directional parity? I have a bunch of options. Let's look at this example. So here's my U F to U corners and U prime F to U edges. So first of all, I can move the bad edges around using slices. So for example, a conjugated slice, R2, S2, R2, that moved this one over here. So now it's even parity. I got to the R0 case. I can do that on either slice. So I can do M2, F2, M2, F2. That got me to R2. So regardless of the setup move, you'll have a conjugated slice that cancels 2. A double slice also works. A double slice is like R2, L2, F2, B2. So that changed my parity. This gets to an R1 case, F2, B2, R2, L2, and of course I can do that in the other direction, F2, B2, R2, L2. And there will be a cancellation regardless of my setup move. And then the final option that I have to move the edges around is a 2e plus e slice insertion. So that would be like fu, fu, fu. That moves this one. That moves this one over. So depending on exactly what the rotation is, some of those will lead to R0 or R1 or R2. The other option I have for fixing directional parity is a regular corner swap. So here's my corner case. If I do a regular corner swap like RFR, then I will change my U F2U corners into U prime R2U corners, and so that changes the directional parity as long as I don't mess with the edges. So if I just do, so here's a bad parity case where these need a U prime, but the corners need a U. If I do a corner swap, say R2 F2 R2, now I've changed that into a good parity. This is an R2 case. If I do, and I have again an option no matter what the setup moves is, and so in this case L2 F2 L2 changes actually this into an R0. So those are all the options for fixing parity: conjugated slice, double slice, or a corner swap, or a 2e plus e slice insertion. One important thing to think about is that the 2e plus e slice corner swap insertion actually changes the floppy corner parity. So if you are in a 0C3 floppy corner case, then that's the one you want to use to fix it, because it will change your corner case to a 0C0. And if you're, of course, in 0C0 already, that's the one you don't want to use. And if in a 6C case, then it doesn't matter. So now we're ready to give a full accounting of all the 2QT continuations in a very intuitive way. So here are all the 2E even parity cases. The R2 and R1 cases everybody knows, but if you're like me, you are missing some of the possible continuations from this R1 case. In addition to, if you just start with the U, it's a +4, but in addition to that +4, you have two wide corner swaps to consider. One of those corner swaps is going to lead to R0. That's this one. And the other corner swap is going to lead to R2. And one of those corner swaps is going to cancel 2, and the other is not going to cancel any. So depending on how the cancellations work out, in addition to that +4, you either have a +1 and a +5, or you have two +3s. So I'm sure most people watching would find that +1 if it exists, but I was definitely not always checking both of those +3s, even when I had the moves to spare. So here are the odd 2E cases. Continuing with the U directly is at least +4, but there are a bunch of different ways to set up to a +3 or better. I certainly didn't know all of them. I suspect very few people have them all memorized, but they're quite easy to generate. You take your setup move and you use it to start a regular corner swap, a conjugated slice, a double slice, or 2E plus E insertion, and see which rotation case it leads to. For example, let me walk through this one. So suppose I ended up here and my setup move was an F2. So corner swap would be here. So that leads to the R1 case. Then a conjugated slice would be F2, R2, L2, B2. That leads to R2. The double slice would be F2, B2, R2, L2. That's going to lead to R1. And then the 2E plus E slice is going to be going to lead to R0. Here are the 4E cases. These are the even parity cases. Pretty familiar. There's one bad rotation here. That's a +3 if you continue straight with a U, but you can get to +4 from any setup move. And there's one setup move, L2 in this case, which will give you a +2. And here are the 4E odd parity cases. Continuing with the U is terrible, but there are a bunch of ways that you can get to a +4. You can get up to a +2 with the right setup move. You'll notice I didn't talk about any cases where the bad edges are on the same UD slice. You don't have to think about those at all. Just always set up your corners in a way that splits your bad edges so that they're evenly split between the UD. faces. So if I had this set up with an F, well, I should use the B instead, and then I could treat this as an odd parity case. If I set this up with an R, then I should have used an L instead, and treat this as an R2 case. And then a few more miscellaneous cases. This one can only be fixed with a 2E, 2E. That's your only option for fixing that one. And then these ones you can't do anything about. This one where your bad edges are here and here. And then this one where you have 0 bad edges also can't be modified in any way. So that's the system. I basically stopped relying on any kind of memorization for HTR minus 2QT because I find this directional parity and rotation so intuitive. And in the cases where you have the budget for +3, 4 moves to HTR, this makes sure that you're not missing any variance. So hope you have fun with it.